Hey everyone, welcome back to Dan91's garage. This week we're back on the turbo log manifold that we're making for the Toyota Starlet. So the welder's set up, I've got the settings written down, and I've had a bit of a practice on some spare pipe, so my technique is now as good as it's going to get. So what we're going to do is weld the pipes together, weld the pipes to the flange. That way we'll have the main body of the exhaust manifold ready to bolt onto the engine, and then we can start looking at turbo placement. There's nothing left to it but to actually get on and weld the damn thing. So I'll see you in a sec. So it's time to start welding up the manifold. So we've got the head flange bolted down to our heatsink, grade 8.8s, and I've already welded on the straight pipe to bring the short radius bends to the same height as our T's. So if we just drop those on now. They'll line up pretty good. So now it's time essentially to tack these all together, because welding this underneath is actually going to be quite difficult. I don't really think the torch is going to get in there, or if it does, it's going to be quite a funky angle. So we'll have to play that one by ear. But the first thing is obviously to tack it all together. Then once we've got it tacked, we can test fit it on the car. So there it is, tacked up the runners together. Some pretty beefy tacks here, and on the other side I've already started to grind through the tacks basically, so this still is free from the actual flange itself. So obviously I've filed the tacks down a bit, so that way it's got the V groove back in it, so when you start to fully weld this, obviously it's a lot easier to run your puddle through that sort of grooved out tack weld than it is to obviously run it into the back of one of these and then have to sort of like start next to it and run in and run out, or whatever you've got to do. So yeah, those bits together. I'll farm away through these. So there we go, a bit more tacking. So tacked on the top of each pipe and also tacked underneath each pipe before this was actually tacked to the flange, so you just lifted it off and then tacked the underside. So realistically I'm not going to be able to weld half of the pipe in one motion, so I've decided to divide it up into quarters and then do a quarter of a pipe at a time, because the results I was getting with there were acceptable. So I've tacked it on 4 places, and I've also now tacked the pipes to the flange. This will allow me to try it on the engine, because as of yet this whole assembly hasn't been in one piece enough to go on the engine. Then we can start resting turbos on stuff and make sure there's going to be clearance for exhausts, and that way it'll give me a better idea as to whether this is going to be a top mount, or a front mount, or a bottom mount basically, or a wherever it fits mount. I think is probably going to be the case. So we've just got to give it the quick test. First things first, it didn't fall apart, and second things, it actually came off the bench, so that's 2 ticks in the box for me. So with the turbo manifold bolted up to the car, we can now test fit the turbo. So if we try the top mount, there's not enough room really to shut the bonnet with the actuator on it, so I don't really fancy doing an external wastegate. We can always rotate the compressor housing down, so this isn't really an issue. So yeah, it looks like we're going for a front mount, so something along those lines really. Obviously you need enough drop from here to the oil pan for the oil to flow back into it nicely. We need to clear out the front so we've got enough room for the air filter. We also need to have enough clearance for the oil filter as well. And then out the back, obviously we need to get an exhaust pipe out of here at a 90 degree, turn it round and then go down to where the rest of the exhaust system's going to be. So it looks like it's going to be a front sort of low mount turbo style. The good thing is as well, the compressor outlet faces down as well, and that's inside the front cross member, because obviously the intercooler is going to be in this space in front of the cross member, or resting on the cross member behind the bumper. So yeah, doesn't look too bad. I think I worked it out to be about sort of 30 or 40 mil off the front of that. Should give us enough room for everything that we need, and obviously depending on how far over we go, the further we can go sort of towards the driver's side, the better, because that'll obviously give us a lot more room to get our exhaust pipe out and round. But yeah, it looks like it's a goer, so we'll carry on welding up the manifold, I think. So it's all tacked up now, and I've also tacked the flange to the actual heatsink as well, because to get access to the underside here for welding, I'm going to have to take out these bolts because the heads get in the way, and also on this side, when I'm coming around here to weld the pipe to the flange, the head of this bolt's going to get in the way. In fact, all 4 of these are, so I've just tacked it there. I've left them in just basically for my own peace of mind. I've got all my settings, so nothing left but to get on with it, I guess. So wish me luck, guys, and I'll see you when it's all welded up. So there it is. I've welded up all the pipes. Had to go back over one of them. I had to cut it back out and then weld back in because I had missed a bit, but certainly not the prettiest thing I've ever welded, but by no means the worst I've ever seen either, so I'm okay with that. But yeah, wait for it to cool down a bit, take out these remaining bolts, then I'll have full access with the torch to do the pipes to the flange. So that's it all welded up now. If I've got any sort of tips on how I welded it, basically, so I've taken it all off now. But basically, when you're welding pipe, so there's a central axis up the middle of this pipe, obviously. So what I did was get the torch at 90 degrees to the joint and then aim the wire through the wall at the central axis as you're travelling. Keep turning as you weld, maintaining the correct stick out or the best you can. So obviously I understand there's different angles you can use for your torch, whether it's push or drag or perpendicular, and they all give sort of different results for penetration and weld bead, but I figured I'd stick with perpendicular to the central axis of the pipe. That way that as I was travelling, invariably there would be a little bit of variance in the torch angle as I was going round, but if I started off and tried to keep perpendicular, at least that way I'd be less off of angle than if I started off with push or drag. So obviously I welded that a quarter at a time, moving around the assembly, so you don't want to put too much heat down all one side because there's a possibility of warping that way and or across the top or whatever. So move around doing different welds in different areas, and always, what I was told as well is obviously when you start a weld it's obviously a bit colder, so there isn't quite as much heat and it's not burning in as well. And because when we get to the back of the pipe there's restricted access for the torch angle, because ideally when you get around the back, obviously you want to keep travelling so you're aiming at the centre of the pipe, but when you get around the back you'd ideally want to be pointing 90 degrees up into it, but you can't get there obviously because you're welding it to the plate. So what I did was obviously started out here because this was going to be the colder, less good weld, or less sort of fused part of it, and then obviously weld round in this direction the best you can, and thankfully I was able enough to get a reasonable enough torch angle to push the hot puddle down into this side which had the restricted access. So that was that basically. Carried on doing that all over the place. Then it came to welding the pipes themselves to the flange. That needed obviously some higher settings in this, so obviously the plate's 10mm thick and these are about 3.5mm thick, so I set it so it would burn well enough into the plate, but if you left it too long on the pipe it would basically vaporize it. Thankfully, like I say, I'm a right-handed welder, so you have one sort of direction of travel that's better than the other. So for me it's obviously turning sort of clockwise, as it were, around the pipe. Thankfully there was good enough access in here that I didn't have to start here and then weld sort of the bad direction for me to finish the hot puddle pushing under here. The access was good enough, so I simply just did quarter sections again, mainly concentrating 45 degrees with the torch, aiming the wire more at the base so it burned into the thicker flange, but then sort of was drawn and it almost sort of washes up the pipe for you and then erodes itself into it. You can watch it burn in as you're travelling round. And again, remember the central axis of the pipe down there, and I was 45 degrees to that, travelling round, sort of slightly whipping it towards the pipe, but it was sort of washing itself in as well at the same time. Again, quarter pipe at a time, because that was how I could finish off a reasonable run without sort of tripping over myself and then getting all sorts of funny angles trying to get around the back. So that was that basically. The other thing was when I was welding up these sections, obviously if you're going to weld half a pipe, if you've experienced enough to do it, which I'm not, you'll end up welding half uphill and then half downhill. Now I don't know if any way's better than the other, and there's plenty of people out there that obviously when they're welding pipeline stuff professionally they know they do as much as they can, and inverted, upside down, all sorts of wonderful stuff. But I could only do quarter pipe at a time, and I found it was easier for me if I set the workpiece so the tacks were at the 10 and 2 position, and then I went essentially a little bit uphill and then a little bit downhill, and that was the best sort of movement I had that gave me the best results on my practice pieces. So that's how I welded that up. It's not the prettiest thing in the world, but I've got some good penetration through the back. Most of the joints have got decent penetration through them. Again, with the settings as they were, when you have the ideal stick out, it was penetrating lovely. But if the stick out increased, obviously that decreased the amperage, as it were, and that's when I probably didn't get as good a burn in. And also from the colder start, that thing I don't think has a hot start function, so obviously the start of each weld was a bit colder, and you can see that from the heat signature that's on the pipes. But like I say, it's stuck together well enough. It's not the ugliest welds I've ever seen or done, so I'm actually really happy with the way that's come out. So now it's all in one piece. I've cleaned up all the spatter and brushed off all the sort of smoke residue that was on it, so it looks a bit nicer than it did. Now it's time to work out where we're going to get the turbo off of this. So obviously we're going to need some sort of pipe coming off here that's going to hold the flange for the turbo. We also need to test this, fit this again to the engine now, so we can sort of find out where that position is. But I've run out of time for this week, guys, so I hope you enjoyed it. The manifold's now one piece, and I'll see you on the next episode. My name's Dan, this is Dan91's Garage. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next episode. One more thing as well, I want to say a big thank you to a guy called Woody. If he's watching, I don't know if he is or not, but I just wanted to say thank you. He spent a good half hour with me on Sunday talking to me about welding pipe, and the practice pieces I'd done, what was good, what was bad, and where I needed to work and what was going on to cause those sorts of issues. So I just want to say a big shout out to him. Really helpful guy and top man.